To pay or not to pay the ransom to the hacker? This issue will be considered in a moment from a legal point of view by Jakub Barański, advocate, senior associate at Wardyński & Partners. Welcome to the program News from Poland, Business and Law, addressed to foreigners acting as board members in Polish companies, foreign investors in Poland, and their foreign advisors.
Hi. In this episode, I'd like to discuss the issue of ransomware, and in particular, dealing with ransom demands. I will try to answer one of the most important questions faced by any business that has had the misfortune of falling victim to a ransomware cyber attack. Whether to comply with the perpetrator's demands or not. Businesses across the world are facing an increasingly hostile cybersecurity environment. In Poland alone, companies reported an over 40% increase in cyber attacks last year, with on average 600 attacks happening each week. And that is only the beginning. The Russian aggression on Ukraine has changed everything, and it will also not be without consequences for cybersecurity. Immediately following the start of the invasion, the ransomware group Conti has publicly threatened to retaliate against countries that will intervene in Ukraine. In the coming years, businesses in all Western countries, Poland included, should therefore expect an increased pressure on their cybersecurity. In this hostile environment, ransomware and its variants has become a more ubiquitous form of cybersecurity risk. The rise of the so-called ransomware as a service model, where ready-to-use ransomware tools and services can be purchased on the dark web, has lowered the cost of such attacks and led to an overall increase in the scale of the ransomware economy. This means that even small and medium-sized enterprises are now becoming valid targets for ransomware-type attacks. It is no longer a risk faced only by major corporations. An inherent element of all ransomware attacks is a ransom demand. After the initial stages of the attack, the perpetrators demand payment of a certain sum from the victim. In exchange for that payment, they promise various things. In some cases, this can be a promise to decrypt important data belonging to the victim, which was encrypted as part of the attack. In other cases, it can be a promise to delete or not to leak sensitive information, which was accessed and copied. There is also a growing trend for cybercriminals to combine these two elements. First, they promise to the victim that they will restore access to encrypted data. If the victim fails to comply with the initial ransom demand, the criminals raise the stakes by informing the victim that in addition to having been encrypted, its sensitive information was also copied and will be publicly leaked if their demands are not met. In some unfortunate cases, the perpetrators make this additional ransom demand even after the victim has complied with the initial payment, forcing it to pay a second time. This type of ransomware attack is consequently called double-extortion. The ransom payments themselves can also vary and are usually tailored to the financial capabilities of the victim, which are assessed long before the actual attack. The smallest reported payments are around the $10,000 mark, but on the other end of the spectrum, we have massive payment demands, sometimes well over several $1 million. Some specialists reported last year that the average ransom demand was a little over $170,000. The decision whether to negotiate with the criminals and pay is always difficult. On an individual level, payment of the ransom might appear the quickest solution to restore operations and avoid liability as well as embarrassment. Indeed, according to recent reports, over 30% of affected businesses chose to pay the ransom. When looked at on a larger scale, though, the decision to pay could be seen as giving fuel to the cyber criminals, encouraging and enabling them to carry out further attacks and possibly financing something far more sinister, such as a rogue government or a terrorist organization. For this very reason, there are some jurisdictions that are currently considering whether to introduce legislation that would ban victims from making ransomware payments altogether. The rationale behind this is that it would remove the financial incentive from criminals and deter them from carrying out further attacks. The solution is not without its critics, however. So far in most jurisdictions, Poland included, it is not illegal as such to pay a ransom. Nevertheless, there are still some legal considerations, as well as moral, that need to be taken into account when taking this type of decision. The decision to pay the ransom could have insurance implications. Not all cybersecurity insurance policies include coverage of costs related to the actual ransom payment. Indeed, some insurers could actually regard the payment of a ransom as potential grounds for denying coverage for the incident altogether. Before deciding on payment, we should therefore make ourselves sure of the specific terms and conditions of our insurance policy. We also need to remind ourselves that the identity of the perpetrators, to whom we would be sending our money, is unknown or at the very least highly unclear. Making the payment could therefore lead to certain risks or issues from the perspective of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing regulations. We could also find ourselves at risk of breaching public sanctions law. If we are a publicly traded company, or one that operates in a highly regulated sector, we should also be mindful of our potential reporting obligations that could require the company to disclose that it had complied with criminal demands and even the amount that it paid, either in a public report or to an appropriate regulatory authority. Finally, companies should consider if paying the ransom will actually yield any expected results. It goes without saying that when dealing with cyber criminals, a company has no real means of securing the transaction or mitigating the risk of the other party failing to perform their end of the bargain. Recent statistics actually paint quite a bleak picture when it comes to the reliability of cybercriminals. Last year, in only about 8% of all cases in which organizations chose to comply with ransom demands, did the perpetrators actually restore all of the encrypted data after they had received payment. That being said, one of the most important questions we should ask when dealing with ransomware is who or what will I be funding if I decide to pay the ransom? Keep this in mind if you or your organization finds itself a victim of a ransomware attack.
Thank you for your attention.